Stay tuned. Ahead I'll talk with Dane Hucklebridge about the Queen of All Mayhem, the blood-soaked life and mysterious death of Belle Starr, the most dangerous woman in the West. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Dane Huckelbridge's previous books include No Beast So Fierce and Castle of Water. He joins us to talk about Queen of All Mayhem. Dane, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, tell us about what piqued your interest in Belle Starr and why you wanted to write a book about her.
Sure, that's a great question. And it's funny, the long story is, when I was a little kid, my mom used to tell us that we were distantly related to Belle Starr on her Texas side. And, in my family tree, we had a number of these kind of stories, some of which I knew for a fact to be true because they were relatively close relatives about, kind of mischievous characters and criminals and whatnot. But the Belle Starr one was always kind of ambiguous. And there was one cousin or something, back in Texas who knew the full story, but I never bothered to look into it. But it was just one of these things that would come up, when you're a kid doing a book report in school or whatever, doing the family tree, not, the genetics family tree type stuff. And I was having a conversation with my editor a few years back just to share some ideas I had for books, to pitch some ideas for nonfiction books. And, none of them felt quite right. And then just casually in conversation, this Belle Starr connection came up, totally unrelated. It wasn't an idea for a book or anything. It just came up over the course of conversation. And it was almost as if, a light bulb went off or the needle skipped off the vinyl. Suddenly he said, wait, tell me more about this Belle Starr. And at that time I said, basically all I knew, which was just a little snippets my mom had told me. She was this female bandit, kind of lady outlaw from the Wild West who eventually got killed in Oklahoma. And immediately he was interested and asked me if I could just write up a short little biographical sketch of her. Just was curious to learn more. And I did that. And he came back and said, I think this could make a book. What do you think? And I thought about it. It had never occurred to me before. It was actually a pretty great idea. And that was just the beginning. And then the research part came in. Because like I said, at the beginning, I was certainly not an expert on Belle Starr. And it turned out I felt very fortunate because once I dug in a little bit and did the research, it turned out she was even more compelling and her story was even more dramatic and kind of adventurous and, exciting than I imagined. So I got very lucky in that regard. And I think it turned out to be a great story. And I think it's an important story as an American to tell.
Well, there's so much in this book. We won't have time, obviously, to talk about it all. So give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
You're going to find the story of a true American original and kind of an unlikely outlaw, because Belle Starr, she came from what would be considered a quote unquote kind of good family. They were reasonably well off. She was reasonably educated, and she very easily could have just, kind of gone down the Southern Belle route or married a wealthy rancher. She could have chosen a very comfortable life, although it would not have been the life she wanted. And I think she craved freedom and her, a certain degree of self-determination. And she followed the outlaw path. That's the path she chose, I think, because at that time, in America in the Wild West, as a woman, that was the way she sought to achieve that level of freedom and self-determination. And it turned out to be a very exciting road indeed, full of adventures, full of criminal exploits, full of interesting friends and chases, and some time spent in the penitentiary. And eventually, it did catch up with her. Eventually, the lifestyle, just like any good sort of Scorsese movie or gangster movie, the lifestyle did catch up with her in the end. But it was a wild ride in the meantime. So if you're looking for a pretty interesting, action-packed, true story about a really unique woman in the Wild West, I think this is it.
I want to come back. You mentioned the research, and there's so much legend about her. I'm curious about that challenge to sort of separate the fact from the fiction, the mythology that was, around her. How did you go about, determining who was the real Belle Starr?
That is indeed the tricky part, particularly, as I say in the book, when you're dealing with a topic and a time that's been so mythologized like the Wild West. And I admit at the beginning of the book that it is a bit, not so much like doing a close academic study, but a bit more like painting a portrait and trying to make it as true to life as possible, because you do end up relying on a lot of these different sources. And there are quite a few legends you have to go on, which you don't want to take at face value, but sometimes, as I discuss in the book, there's some truth in there. And even though what would be considered pretty hard documentation, things like records, things like newspaper articles, at this time and place, you can't totally rely on. And a good example of this is one of her marriage certificates. Belle Starr actually lied about her age. So I mean, even something like a marriage certificate or a birth certificate, you can't always count on being accurate. And journalists at this time definitely took liberties to sell copies of newspapers. So there is an art to it. It's not strictly a science. You do have to winnow through all these stories and tidbits and whatnot, and try to figure out what seems the most likely to be true. And in the end, you end up with some facts you're fairly certain of, and then others, you have to do the best you can, and you have to acknowledge that you're not sure, because again, we're talking about organized crime here. I mean, she was essentially involved in frontier organized crime. And just like Al Capone, to put him behind bars, they ended up having to rely on tax evasion because it was so hard to prove what he was doing in the shadows. You have very much that same phenomenon where it's hard to say what all she was getting up to, but you can get a pretty good sense based on some of the folklore, also what the federal authorities and tribal authorities were going after for and trying to charge her with. What she did get charged with, she did ended up getting charged with horse theft and being found guilty and having to go to prison. And also just how people wrote about her in the press and things like that. And when you look at all of these factors together, you start to paint this portrait of a woman who was indeed the head of a criminal gang, organized frontier crime. And she was certainly involved in horse theft, almost certainly involved in armed robbery, probably involved in some smuggling and whiskey smuggling and things like that as well. So, she had kind of a diverse criminal portfolio, I think. And that's, when you look at all the evidence, it's hard not to reach that conclusion.
Well, as you mentioned, she did lead a gang of horse thieves, was involved in robberies and that sort of thing. And then later in her life, she married Sam Starr and became part of the Cherokee Nation. And that got her to a whole different level of criminal activity.
Yes, indeed. That was her entree, I think, into living and becoming part of Cherokee society. And it was her entree into this family, the Starr family, which was, a legendary family in Cherokee and American history, in part because they were political rebels essentially during the Cherokee Civil War, and then went on to become something of a warlord, possibly you could say, gangsterish activity. It gets kind of blurred. But she married into this family, and I think that did allow her to reach another level. That gave her a kind of independence that I think back in the, kind of more, I guess you could say, male-dominated Anglo frontier society was very hard for her to achieve. And for years, she'd been running with these various outlaws. Her first husband, Jim Reed, was a criminal and a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And she was always playing sick and fiddle, and she would accompany him on heists and things like that. She was sort of a sidekick. And then he would inevitably blow all the money, even when they had a big score, like the famous Grayson robbery. He would blow it in gambling, saloons, brothels, all the kind of typical places you could expect someone like that to waste their money. And at a certain point, I think she just got fed up with it. She got tired of always being a sidekick, of always having to sit on the sidelines while these kind of problematic men she had a habit of running with would spend all the money or get into trouble. And I think it was in the Cherokee Nation that she really came into her own. And I think part of that was probably cultural reasons. If you look at the history of Cherokee culture and the role women have in that society, it was much more of a matrilineal society. Clan membership, property, custody of children went through the maternal line. And there was this tradition of female warriors and female tribal leaders that I think was absent in the more, the Anglo frontier society. And I think all of these were factors. And beyond that, too, I think there's just the fact that she had very useful criminal skills. And you had the Starr family and, Tom Starr and his son Sam Starr, who had a long history of dealing in kind of stolen horse flesh and fencing horses, things like that. And also protection racket. They had a long history of protecting usually, Anglo criminals from the frontier. They would go into what was then Indian territory to these native nations and hide out. And they would, give them money in exchange for protection. And Belle Starr had two things going for her. one, she was an expert on horses. She grew up on essentially a stud and a livestock farm, and she, her father bred horses. She was an expert on horses, which was a useful skill to have when you're trying to appraise and sell horses. And also, she was just, as I say, this kind of walking Wild West Rolodex of outlaws. And she was friends with Frank and Jesse James. She was friends with the Youngers. She had all these contacts in the sort of frontier criminal world that were definitely useful for a family that had a long history of making money offering, safe houses and protection to criminals. So I think that, one of the things about the criminal world is it's very egalitarian in a certain aspect, because they're interested in making money. They don't get so hung up on, I don't know, to a certain extent, maybe gender roles or societal positions, things like that. And she fit in there, and initially she did quite well, and she rose the ranks of criminal life there to the point where she was leading her own gang, at first alongside her husband Sam Starr, and then I think later on her own, as her own kind of little mini mafia don, I guess you could say.
I also want to point out for potential readers that in addition to the text, you have a center section of the book that's filled with photographs and further information. And one of them right at the beginning of that section is a cover of a little magazine or tabloid by Richard K. Fox, where I think it was published shortly after her death, which helped sort of push that legend.
Yes, he did. Yeah. That was really what launched her into the public eye. Prior to that, she had a long-standing criminal record and problems with authorities, and she was kind of this local, colorful character with a checkered past in that area of kind of northern Texas, Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma. But she wasn't very well known beyond that. And then after her death, kind of just by coincidence, someone sent out a dispatch or something from one of the local papers. The New York Times got wind of it, and at that time it was such a novelty. This lady bandit who is killed gangland style out in the Indian Territory, that they ran her obituary. And this guy Fox, who was something of a true crime tabloid publisher, in addition to promoting boxing fights, he saw this and recognized instantly the potential, and found a writer to go out there, do a little poking around and write a book about her life. And that's what catapulted her onto the national stage. And Belle Fever essentially took off from there. That's when she became something of a household name. And beyond that, there'd be other books written about her, theatrical plays, songs, poems, you name it. And she definitely did become, I would say, something pretty close to a household name in the last decade of the 1800s and the first half of the 20th century.
I would also say that this book is not only just a portrait of her, but also a way to sort of examine the times that she lived in.
I think so too. And what makes her story so fascinating is she really is an exceptional character, in that she lived at the crossroads of all of these really critical moments in American history and historical currents. And she just happened to be there, through good luck, bad luck, whatever you want to call it. But the kind of border wars and the guerrilla activity in Missouri during the Civil War, she was there. Her family was involved. She apparently worked as kind of a Confederate teenage spy, passing on reconnaissance information to her brother Bud, who was a bushwhacker at the time, a Confederate guerrilla. And then her family eventually resettled and left the ruins of Missouri to go to Texas. And there she was right outside of Dallas during the birth of the Wild West, essentially. And she mixed up with all these characters and all these outlaws and got to know them and befriended many of them. And then beyond that, you have her involvement with the Cherokee Nation and the other native nations around there. And, she became directly involved with kind of tribal politics and what was happening then, and these sort of, many of the efforts of these native peoples to keep their land and prevent it from being taken or annexed or things like that. So you see her she provides a really interesting perspective to examine American history, I think. Because just in seeing her story, you get this little sort of peephole through the curtains of time on all this other stuff that was going on in America, these really sweeping currents going all the way back to Western expansion, following her family west to end up in Missouri and then Texas, all the way up to the end of the Wild West period. And when she was finally gunned down and executed, shot off her horse, it sort of corresponded to the end of the Wild West. Or she was killed in 1889, and that's really right around when what you would consider the Wild West kind of came to an end. So she was there at the very beginning of it, saw it through, lived the Wild West outlaw life, and kind of closed the curtains right around when that period in American history did.
Well, as the subtitle of your book indicates, her death is a mystery. We know how she was killed, but we don't know who, or particularly why, although I assume she had a long list of enemies.
She did have a long list of enemies, and it is a mystery that's still unsolved to this day. And I spend a lot of time discussing this in the back of the book, and I don't want to give too much away, but there are a number of suspects. One was this sharecropper, this white sharecropper who had gotten a lease dispute over some land he was renting when she was living in the Cherokee Nation, and essentially the lease agreement fell apart, but it caused bad blood, and there was some known bad blood between them. So that was one suspect. Her husband at the time, there was some whisperings that he might have had something to do with it, to try to get his hands on Younger's Bend, which was this outlaw ranch that she called home. And there's some thoughts that, this younger conniving husband might have conspired to have her killed to get his hands on that. Some people have even claimed her own children might have had something to do with it. I'm pretty skeptical about that, but that's been put forward as a possibility. And then she also had a lot of enemies in tribal government, because she'd been a thorn in the sides of the Cherokee Nation and other nations around there for some time. And it's, she definitely had people in tribal government who were, tribal police, things like that, who were pretty fed up with her. And you definitely saw her as kind of an outsider causing problems there. So that's a possibility too. So there's a number of possibilities, and it does make for a great murder mystery. And I do talk about this. I won't give too much away, but yeah, I go into as much detail as I can about the different suspects and their motives, and how likely it is that they were the actual, assassins who pulled the trigger and then executed her.
Well, Belle Starr is a fascinating historical figure, although not exactly a role model. But why do you think her story is still relevant to today?
I think it's relevant because, like you said, she was certainly not a role model, but I think in her own unique American way, she was definitely a trailblazer. And what she accomplished at that time, granted, illegally, but she did blaze this trail. She did do something no one else was really doing, and rose to a position of respect and authority in her own unique alley that was unique for anyone at that time and place. But as a woman at a time when, they were denied so many liberties and basic rights, it's really exceptional what she accomplished. So I think, obviously, as I say in the book, you don't want to glorify your criminals and whatnot. And she was a criminal, there's no denying it. But I think her story is definitely worth studying and learning, just because she was such a trailblazer. She definitely did something that few others were doing at that time, and set an example of a woman who did definitely, reject authority and rose to a position of real influence and power at a time when that was exceedingly difficult.
To learn more, the book is Queen of All Mayhem, The Blood-Soaked Life and Mysterious Death of Belle Starr, the Most Dangerous Woman in the West, by Dane Huckelbridge. Dane, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
If you'd like to purchase Queen of All Mayhem by Dane Huckelbridge, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.